Portland's mills, at the same time, realize they can't keep on selling their produce, their textiles for less than cost if they're paying high prices for American raw materials, American cotton. So they switch over to buying cotton from India. They know it is a lower quality of cotton, but their plan is to do this just long enough to force the prices back down, and then they hope that the prices will stay there. And that works too. So the price of cotton goes from 30 cents a pound in 1818 to 9 cents a pound in 1823. And now we're looking at the question of whether, in fact, you can afford to grow cotton or if it's going to be a losing proposition if you have to sell the raw material, the cotton, for less than it costs to produce it. Well, even after the mills went back to American cotton, the price stayed low because all of that cotton-producing land that had been purchased in Alabama and Mississippi is now producing cotton. And the production doubles. So the price is not going to recover even after the British go back to buying from America. That's what it took to make the bubble burst. And with the news of the crashing cotton prices on top of all of the other bad news, the Panic of 1819 actually begins in earnest. So we have a collapse of every aspect of the national economy in 1819. Jefferson is actually the first person to use the P word. There's been some debate over this. Where does panic come from as a name for a financial crisis? I can't find anybody before Thomas Jefferson who, in 1819, gives the name that all of the future financial crashes will be known by. All is panic. And Jefferson knew what he was talking about. He was one of many, many farmers who had no way of repaying the loans that they had taken out, and Monticello would eventually have to be sold to pay off Jefferson's debts. By that time, it came complete with Jefferson's grave because he had died and been buried on the spot, but he died insolvent. Currency had been over $100 million in circulation, falls to $40 million over the next 4 years. That's a huge decrease. William Crawford, again, the Secretary of State, or of Secretary of Treasury, says, as there is no recorded example in the history of nations of a reduction of the currency so rapid and so extensive, few examples have occurred of distress so general and so severe as that which has been exhibited in the United States. And Crawford was absolutely right. Kind of an irony. The newest, biggest building in the biggest city in the country, Philadelphia, well, ex-biggest, New York had just passed it, second biggest city in the U.S. The largest, newest building was the almshouse, the poorhouse. And the poorhouse very quickly filled. The panic produced bankruptcies, something that the United States had never known before, unemployment. There had always been a labor shortage in America because land was so cheap, people didn't want to work for wages, they wanted to head west and own their own. So now all of a sudden there are people who can't get jobs in American cities. In Philadelphia, it's over 50% unemployment in some cities. In Richmond, the real estate boom is completely reversed and real estate values fall more than half. In Cincinnati, more than half the commercial real estate in Cincinnati is foreclosed on by the Bank of the United States, everything from warehouses to coffee houses. And the Bank of the U.S. has to open an entire second branch in Cincinnati for the purpose of simply liquidating foreclosed property. So the per capita domestic product crashes to the lowest point. It goes down from $130 to $70 per capita. Will never be that low again in American history. This really is the first Great Depression in the United States. And debtors in 1819 faced threats that today we don't think about, but there were debtors' prisons in all the cities of the country. John Piatt, not a familiar name anymore, but he was the richest man in Ohio. He opened the first bank in the state of Ohio. And he died in debtor's prison at the age of 40 because of the Panic of 1819. Famous people would go to debtor's prison, but so would people that nobody had ever heard of. Hannah Crispy in 1819 was imprisoned along with her nursing infant for failure to pay a $12 debt. She was put in prison. 20 days in, her daughter dies, and the creditor still not will allow her to be discharged to go to the funeral because he hasn't been paid his $12 back. There's a big movement to end debtors' prisons, and in every state, the legislatures turn it down. They think that debtors' prisons need to remain. The political language of the time had power opposed to liberty. Those were the two great oppositions. And Thomas Hart Benton in Missouri had no doubt about where the enemy of liberty was in the money power. Benton was quite an orator, and as he saw it, all the cities were in the jaws of the monster. This became the name of the Bank of the United States to most people. It was the monster. A lump of butter in the mouth of a dog, one gulp, one swallow, and all is gone. Well, what are you going to do? Maryland was, like most other states, it had taxed its own banks for a long time, but Maryland decided in 1819 that they were going to put a tax on every dollar, every banknote issued by the Bank of the United States in Maryland, and the bank refused to pay. So we get one of the most famous and most significant Supreme Court decisions of all time when the lawsuit works its way up to the U.S. Supreme Court, and Justice John Marshall, the Chief Justice, writes for the unanimous court that the state may not tax a bank because the bank is an agency of the federal government. This despite the fact that it's 80% privately owned and it paid its investors regular dividends all through the Depression. McCulloch, by the way, was the head cashier in Baltimore, and he will be back in court a year later when he is arrested for defrauding the Bank of the United States by lending himself $1 million, with which he bought stock in the Bank of the United States. Bad timing. The stock had been rising, and of course now it crashed, and he lost all of the bank's money. McCulloch was acquitted, he and his two accomplices, because the court said Maryland had no law against defrauding banks. They had not gotten around to passing such a regulation. And so because what they had done might have been fraud, it was not illegal in Maryland, and McCulloch never did go to prison. But the Supreme Court of the United States did a lot more than simply preserving the bank. This is the room that they met in for 50 years. It's in the basement of the Capitol, which gives you an idea of what Congress thought about the Supreme Court, that they would not give them their own building. They wouldn't even give them a room that wasn't subterranean until the time of the Civil War. But in this room, immediately below the House of Representatives, Marshall upheld the power of Congress to charter a bank, even though that power is never mentioned in the Constitution of the United States. And he said, I'm quoting the ruling of McCulloch versus Maryland, "Let the end be legitimate, let it be within the scope of the Constitution, and then all means which are appropriate are constitutional." Congress has a constitutional goal in mind. Any means they take to attain that goal will be constitutional. You can imagine Southerners and Westerners were flabbergasted. The Supreme Court judge from, not the U.S. Supreme Court, but state Supreme Court judge from Virginia, Spencer Roane, said that Marshall's decision was the result of a money-loving, funding, stock-jobbing spirit that was prepared to sell our liberties for a mess of pottage. And there were people who went beyond Spencer Roane. John Randolph of Roanoke was one of the most eloquent orators of the time, and Randolph was very uncharacteristically at a loss for words. And all he could think of to say was, wrong, wrong, all wrong. But that was Marshall's decision, and it was the law of the land. Upstairs, in the Capitol building, the other shoe dropped. That same week that the McCulloch versus Maryland decision was issued, James Talmadge of New York introduced an amendment to the Missouri statehood bill that would refuse admission as long as the state of Missouri did not prohibit slavery. Southerners thought this was an inevitable consequence of Marshall's decision, of the McCulloch decision, that Congress will now claim the constitutional power to do things that previously everyone seemed to have agreed were unconstitutional. And they would debate the Missouri admission for the next 2 years. It would go on really until 1821 with an intensity that no one was prepared for. They had previously, before Missouri, 4 more states in the previous 4 years had been admitted to the Union without discussion. And they pretty much alternated slave states and free states. But there had been nothing in the debates over admitting Indiana or Mississippi or Illinois that gave any hint of the violence of the reaction in the Missouri statehood question. Back just the previous November, Mississippi State Senator George Poindexter had voted to admit Illinois as a free state. And at that time he said, it would be a blessing could we get rid of slavery. But the wisest and the best among us have not been able to devise a plan for doing so. So at that moment, November 1818, when cotton prices are still soaring, when land sales in Alabama are setting records, McCulloch has not gotten to the Supreme Court yet, a Southern senator in Congress expresses a hope that slavery could someday be eradicated from the United States, and not one Southerner in Congress speaks to defend the institution in 1818. But by the time the Missouri debates begin, 4 months later, the Panic of 1819 has changed everything. Southerners are deep in debt for the land that they have bought in Alabama, Mississippi. They're angry over the policies of the Bank of the United States that is drawing the silver out of the western states and sending it east. And they are furious that the McCulloch decision not only preserves the bank, but actually implies far fewer limits now on what Congress can do constitutionally in the future. 1819, there's suddenly a razor-thin profit margin on cotton. The only way planters can avoid forfeiting the millions of dollars that they have invested in lands is to increase the volume of production. Right? As long as there's just a little bit of profit, the more cotton they can grow, they'll be able to pay their land bills, and they need slaves to do that. So the extension of slavery in the eyes of the South now is not a means to fabulous wealth. It's actually a necessity for economic survival. Fear rather than greed seems to be the motive. The economic historians Samuel Williamson and Lewis Kahn have calculated that the value of the slave population in 1819, 1820, the 2 years immediately after the panic, when cotton prices were tanking, that value has never been matched in the history of the institution. So in 1820, when total land sales in Illinois had dropped all the way down to $87,000, there were still over $1 million in Alabama. People were still buying cotton land with the belief that if they could just grow more cotton, they'd be able to pay their debts. In the 2 years before that, cotton in Alabama had averaged 5.5 million pounds per year, and in the next 2 years it would average 23 million pounds a year. They're going to grow enough cotton to pay their debts, but they're going to grow enough cotton to ensure that the price of cotton is not going to recover. It's going to remain marginal all that while. Congressmen from the cotton states, Alabama and Mississippi, were so worried about the Depression following 1819 that, unlike most Southerners, they were willing to support a Missouri Compromise, a compromise that would enable them to then get on to legislation that would provide debt relief for Southern land investors. And from Huntsville, Alabama, Thomas Percy writes to his senator, who happens to be his brother-in-law, and tells him that the panic has overshadowed everything else. In Alabama, the great interests of the nation, the Spanish relation, the more momentous Missouri question, are not thought of or talked about by anyone. The only topic on people's minds is the Depression. So the panic not only aggravated the Missouri crisis, but it also motivated the solution of it, because now the cotton states are prepared to vote for a compromise, even though the hardliners in both the North and South are digging in their heels against a compromise. Economic fear is what's going to provide the votes to make the compromise happen. The panic of 1819 was especially devastating because nobody had ever seen anything like it. There had never been a Great Depression, a national depression before. It stopped the country in its tracks. In the South and in the West, it lasted until the mid-1820s, and gradually it did lift. But the pattern of economic boom and bust, the blind speculation fed by easy credit and a lack of regulation, those would become all too familiar. The panic made Andrew Jackson president of the United States. Jackson killed the second bank of the U.S. as he had promised, and he was barely out of the White House when the next panic arrived, the Panic of 1837. It would be followed by panics of 1857, 1873, 1893, 1907, the crash of 1929, and as recently as 2008, we experienced the Great Recession brought on by irresponsible lending and irrational speculation. But today, we're right next door to the Trump building, so I have to say the economy is booming, and the burdensome banking regulations have been rolled back. And in New York, everyone knows the only direction that real estate can go is up, up, up. And that's my story.